Greetings, my name is Kerry and welcome back to my channel. Today I have another recent reads video for you. I haven't had a lot of time for filming recently, so I'm filming 2 recent reads videos again today because I've finished 10 books since I filmed the last one. Just like struggling a little bit to find A, time to read, B, time to film, C, time to edit, and D, time to upload and caption my videos. Anywho, so I'm going to be talking about 5 books today that I finished between the 30th of May and the 18th of June. So that was about a week ago at time of filming. Enough chit chat, let's just get on with the books. The first book that I finished in that period was Father and Son by Edmund Gosse. So this is a memoir, was published at the start of the 20th century about Edmund Gosse's experiences growing up in quite a strict religious household in the 1850s. His parents were Brethren, which is quite a strict sect or denomination of Christianity. He had in some ways quite a restricted childhood. He didn't really have any friends his own age. His parents were very religious, but they had some quite weird ideas, I would say, about how that should impact on their lives. So for example, his mother decided that anything fictional written was lying, so he wasn't allowed to have any novels growing up because they weren't true. That's just one example. But his father was quite famous in his time as a marine biologist, fairly well known for speaking out against Darwin's ideas. Because of his religious background at the time, he didn't know how to weigh up in his head the things that were being discovered about the age of the earth compared with the biblical account of creation, which he believed was a strict 7-day creation thing. There are still some Christians that do think that today, but with a lot more scientific knowledge, I think that is much less common. But that put him at odds with a lot of the scientific community and quite affected his career, and that had an impact on Edmund as a child. The blurb of this book was written by someone who I think must have been quite anti-Christian because it describes the childhood. It uses a phrase that Edmund Gosse remains sane is extraordinary. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. Like, some of the stuff that happened in his childhood we would probably not consider okay these days, but in the time I don't think it was that uncommon. And actually, as someone grew up in not a strict Christian upbringing, but my parents are both from Brethren backgrounds, so I had a bit of an understanding of what he was talking about anyway, and actually it ain't that bad. When I was doing a little bit of reading around this online, trying to find out a bit more about his father, actually other sources say that this account is even quite exaggerated and makes it sound worse than it was. If you're interested in a memoir of childhood in the 1850s and of a particular type of childhood in the 1850s, then maybe pick this one up. I would have liked to hear a bit more about his father's scientific endeavours, because what I found out from my further research was that his father, whose name I can never actually remember, was the person that invented aquariums. So like, we wouldn't have things like big aquariums where we could go and see amazing sea creatures if it hadn't been for his father. So I think there could have been a lot more of an exploration of that, but as I've mentioned, this is quite a one-sided account of a fairly restricted childhood, but it makes out to be, yeah, maybe more extreme than it actually was. I don't really know what else to say about it. I will give a content warning. This edition is quite an old edition. This was published in the early 70s. There is a use of the N-word, so what I would suggest is if you are interested in reading this book, try and see if there is a more modern edition out that I would hope would have that corrected in. I don't know really what else to say about that, but just be aware of it. So I'm not even sure if this book is still in print. It's one that my dad gave me. He had it when he was a teenager and gave it to me recently after he'd reread it. Yeah, just be aware of that if you are interested in reading this book, that it does contain that word. So that book I gave 3 stars. The next book is one of my favourite books of the year so far, and I'm pretty sure will make it onto my end of the year celebration list. It is such an amazing book and I cannot speak highly enough about it. So this is The Deep by Rivers Solomon. This book is just fantastic. The book was inspired by a rap song by a band called Clipping, and I've listened to the song as well and it was absolutely amazing. The idea is that the African slaves who were thrown overboard because they were pregnant, they gave birth underwater and their offspring became this race of underwater people called the Wajinru. The main character in this book is called Yetu, and she is the historian of her people, so she contains all of the memories of all of her people since the first ones were born, their mothers having been thrown overboard. Every year they have a ceremony called the Remembrance, where Yetu tells the story of her people to everyone else, and so they all have this period of remembering together, but then everyone else, the memories fade, and it's just Yetu who carries the weight of that for her people. And this was something that was decided by the people in the earliest days so that they could live free from the memory of the oppression that their mothers had suffered. So this story has a lot about grief, it has a lot about memory and how her people have coped with the weight of oppression. I thought it was very apt to read at this time. I read this book pretty much in one sitting the weekend after the death of George Floyd, when the Black Lives Matter movement was gaining some momentum, gaining some traction, and a lot of worldwide visibility. It was really powerful to be reading this book at that time because the black community are still feeling this oppression, and a lot of it does go back to the history of slavery. So this book was really, really powerful. River Solomon is a brilliant author. They are a non-binary author, and this is the second book of theirs that I've read, and I really, really loved it. So I will be keeping an eye out anytime they publish anything else because I just really want to keep reading their words. Their books are not easy reads. The other one, The Unkindness of Gosse, was a really difficult read in places. This one felt a little bit less harsh in some ways. I don't use that as a negative thing. Both books contain quite a lot of difficult things to read, examples of trauma and oppression. It was slightly less graphic maybe in this one, but there was still some really difficult stuff in there. I'm trying to remember if there are any content warnings I need to give. There is some self-harm and discussion of suicide, also history of trauma of the way her ancestors were treated. But yes, really, really, really excellent book. The next book that I finished was The Secret Woman by Victoria Holt. And just hold that where you can hopefully see that. This was the second Victoria Holt book I've read and I really, really loved it. Victoria Holt is an author that I want to keep finding her books. It's actually a pseudonym and I can't remember the author's actual name, which is slightly awful. But she wrote a number of books under a number of different pseudonyms, and she used different pseudonyms for different genres. So Victoria Holt was her pseudonym for her Gothic romance books. This book was first published in 1970, but it is set in the late Victorian era. The main character is Anna. She spent early years of her life in India, where her father was in the military, but then she was sent back to England to live with her aunt so she could attend school. So she was brought up by her aunt. Her aunt was an antiques dealer. I'm trying to explain the story in a way that doesn't make it too complicated. So the village that she and her aunt live in, a lot of its wealth has come from a shipping company, and the owners of the shipping company have a big house up on the hill. There are two sons of that family, but one is the illegitimate son of the previous head of the household. He basically got one of the maids pregnant when it looked like his wife wasn't going to be able to have children, but then around the same time she fell pregnant as well. So he had two sons born 2 weeks apart, one legitimate, one illegitimate. So Anna meets Redvers, who's the illegitimate son. She immediately is really attracted to him. She then finds out that he is actually already married. He is the captain of one of the ships of the shipping company, and one time when he was on a voyage with the shipping company, he married a Polynesian woman. The novel opens with us finding out that Anna's Aunt Charlotte has just passed away, and there's a bit of a mystery surrounding that. Towards the end of her life, the aunt had a nurse called Chantal, who is Anna's closest friend. So Chantal then goes to the big house to nurse Monique, who is the wife of Redvers, the captain, who the British climate does not agree with her. She has a lot of chest problems. I think it's either asthma or bronchitis or a mixture of both, while Anna tries to continue her aunt's business but finds that she has a lot of debt to deal with. So the story evolves from there. I'm not going to go into too much more detail. A lot of that happens quite early on in the story, so I don't think I've given away too many spoilers yet. I really, really loved this book, but there was an element of it that was a bit problematic that I want to talk about, but it may be a bit spoilery. What I'm going to say is I love this book. I gave it 4 stars. I know there are problems with it. If you want to find out a bit more about the slightly problematic elements, then carry on watching, but if you don't want to hear any spoilers, then skip ahead till I'm not holding up this book anymore when I move on to the next book. The slightly problematic element is the portrayal of the Polynesian people, and particularly Monique. Although for the time it was set, actually, and it's told in first person perspective, so it's told from Anna's perspective, actually her attitude is more sensitive than I think a lot of people's would have been in the time the book is set, but there is some reference to savage behaviour when she and Chantal eventually end up on the island, which is a made-up island, but it's modelled on existing Polynesian islands, but I'm pretty sure the one that they go to is a fictional one that Victoria Holt created. Part of the reason this is problematic as well is because it borrows a trope that we first saw in Jane Eyre of the foreign wife as an obstacle to the main character's happiness. She and Revers are clearly very attracted to each other, but he has this wife. The wife is ill, and so there's this tension of what is going to happen to his wife. Is that barrier going to be removed for Anna to have her happy ending? There's a lot more to the story than that, and I don't want to give away like any of the big spoilers, and actually the way the plot worked out didn't fall into the trap that I thought it was going to, of Monique being removed in a unsatisfactory way. So the resolution of the story was much better than I was expecting. But yeah, just be aware of that if you do want to read this book, that some of that representation is not great, but I would say that's probably to do with the time it was written in the 70s and the time it was set in the late Victorian era. And I think that is going to be something that may be a bit of a theme with some of Victoria Holt's books. So the other one that I read, The Curse of the Kings, was set around the same period, maybe slightly later, early 20th century, and set a lot in Egypt. And again, some of the representation of the Egyptian people mentioned in that story, again, was slightly problematic. If you are interested in reading Victoria Holt's books, just be aware that is something that might come up in them, that she doesn't always represent other cultures in the best way, but compared to other representation is not terrible, if that makes sense. Hopefully I've explained that fairly well. Anywho, so really enjoyed this book. Okay, so welcome back to anyone that skipped ahead to avoid the spoilers. So the next book that I finished was Hold Back the Stars by Katie Kahn. This is a book that I've had out from the library for a little while. This is science fiction romance story. It's told in a dual timeline, so the book opens with the two main characters, Karis and Max, have just been separated from their spaceship and they discover they only have 90 minutes of air left. So the rest of the story alternates between their attempts to try and get back to their ship and save their lives, and the story of how they met and how they ended up on the ship together. This was beautifully written, really well thought out. It's kind of utopian dystopian. The context, the world that Katie Kahn creates that these two characters live in, it's thought to be a utopian society. It's been created after a large world war that killed large swathes of the global population, and it's about how the rest of the population of the world are trying to recover from that and create this new society where hopefully war won't happen again. But it makes it very clear that actually the ideals, the concepts that this society is built on, while utopian for a lot of people, may not work for everyone, and so that is one of the issues that's considered within the book. And the way they described it, I was like, yeah, no, that society is not one that I would enjoy living in, I don't think. Although some elements of it did quite appeal. I thought it was really cleverly put together, really cleverly told. Content warnings in this one for miscarriage and for discussion of suicide and for mental illness, particularly PTSD. I didn't know going into this book that I had PTSD representation, and as someone who has PTSD myself, the representation was spot on for what my experience of PTSD has been. The explanations of, or the descriptions of being triggered by unexpected things, I felt really seen reading that particular part of the book and how that is explained. Really spot on a mental health rep there. I don't really know what else to say about this. I really enjoyed this. I was a bit concerned to start with because some of it is told in present tense, but those are the sections where the characters have been separated and try and get back to their ship, so it does make the distinction like there's a present tense storyline and a past tense storyline, and actually that worked really well and I thought it was really effective. Some of the sciencey concept in here I thought were really good, particularly the discussion of AI towards the end I found really excellent. I thought that was a really clever concept. I really highly recommend this book. Really enjoyed it. I think I gave it 4 stars in the end. There were just one or two things that I was like, no, that didn't quite work for me, but actually a lot of it was really good. So that was another one that I loved. And then the final book that I'm going to talk about today was an ebook that I read, which was White Rage by Carol Anderson. I picked this up for the Blackout Buddy Read, which was organised by Shay from Books with Shay. The second book for that, White Fragility, I'm still reading at the moment, but finding it really, really interesting as well. So I will link the live show that Shay hosted for that buddy read in the description. I would say go and check it out. I know that there has been a little bit of controversy about one of the panellists on that discussion and their interactions with other booktubers, but I'd say aside from that, the rest of the discussion is really, really useful, particularly for white people to learn from the experiences of black content creators. I certainly learned a lot from that discussion, and I was really grateful to the panellists for doing that emotional labour to educate all of us about their experiences. But going back to the book White Rage, I don't really know very much about American history. It's not something we really learn about in the UK at all, even. So I didn't really know anything about it. I knew a little bit about the Civil War and what happened around that from some of the stuff I've read before, but like many people, I'd assumed that once slavery was abolished in the States, that was it, and then obviously civil rights movement in the 60s, but I hadn't really put together why that was necessary and why there are still problems today. White Rage spells it out so clearly what has been going on about the systemic racism in the USA, and to me it was really, really eye-opening. As I say, I didn't really know anything about it, and to read some of the stories, some of the things that people have suffered, just really shows why the Black Lives Matter movement is so important and why we need to be challenging racism everywhere we see it. Content warnings for this book: it is an academic book about racism, so there are quite a lot of uses of the N-word in contextual quotes from different periods that show how people in power felt about black people within America. Also, a number of descriptions of racial violence, some of them in fairly graphic detail. I struggle with like quite graphic violence, and I didn't find that this was too much in one sense. It was shocking, and it was meant to be shocking, but it didn't make me feel ill, if that makes sense. So it was hard to read, but it wasn't unnecessary gory details, I'll say. But if that is something you are sensitive to, do be careful going into this book. I would say it's a really valuable book for people to read, but just be aware that it tackles some very difficult topics, and it does include things for shock factor to make people stop and think about racial inequality. I gave White Rage 5 stars as well. So those were the 5 books I read between the 30th of May and the 18th of June. Other than the first book, they were all 4 or 5 stars, and even Father and Son, I did enjoy reading it. There were just, yeah, it was an okay book, and then the other books were really, really great books. So it was a really good couple of weeks of reading there. That's it for this video, so let me know down in the comments if you've read any of those books and what you thought of them. What are some books that you've been reading recently as well? Please also like this video if you liked it, and please subscribe if you haven't already. And you can also follow me on my social media. So I'm on Twitter and I'm on Instagram as @KerryLouiseReads, and I'm also on Goodreads as Kerry Louise. So do go and connect with me on those places if you want to. But that's it for today, so thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye!